I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we can believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt. I teach media studies at Greenville University, and here I am doing this podcast.
I'm Dean. I am a PhD student in philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, and here I am doing this podcast.
Here I am. It's his podcast. It's the
here we are.
The Weird Al parody of Here I Am to Worship. All right. So in this episode, we have a really cool interview with Heath Carter on May Day, and you're going to really dig it. There's lots of cool stuff in there about the history of Christianity and leftism and sort of its impact on the labor movement, and lots of really good sort of instructive moments for your own organizing and activism, I think. But before we get that far, I have a really funny iTunes review that I need to read, and Dean hasn't heard it yet, so I'm really excited for his completely honest reaction to this.
My ears, they're
review.
Wide open.
So this is a 5 out of 5 star review, obviously, and it is titled Magnificast.
Okay.
So this user writes, eagerly downloading what I dyslexically interpreted to be a series of hour-long declamations on the hijinks of a number of notable felines, I instead found a pair of academics nimbly navigating the intersection of Christianity and leftist politics, which, is pretty good too.
Big consolation prize.
Yeah, it's pretty good. So unfortunately, this is the Magnificast. You can check out the other podcast, Magnificats, for the cats, but, different podcasts, not ours.
Different podcasts.
Someone's got that out there, right? That is the name of someone's podcast. Their podcat. All right, well, let's get rid of these podcasts and get over to Heath Carter.
Jesus Christ was a man that traveled through the land, hard-working man and brave. He said to the rich, give your goods to the poor, so they laid Jesus Christ in his grave.
So this week, it is May Day. In fact, today, when we're recording it, it's May Day. So we're talking with Heath Carter, tomorrow's May Day. What is it?
Tomorrow's
today?
May Day.
Right, it's April 30th. All right, well, by the time this comes out, it's going to be long after May Day anyway. In any case, we're talking with Heath Carter in light of May Day this week, and we're really excited about it. We talked to Heath a while back in an episode on his book, Union Made. And in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about some of his research in a book that he edited with some other folks called The Pew and the Picket Line. But before we just kind of jump into it, Heath, what have you been up to lately?
I have been doing a lot of teaching and grading. We've got about 10 days left before the end of the semester here at Valparaiso University, where I teach, and also a good bit of conferencing. I've been going to a number of different conferences to talk about this new book that I'm working on, which is a kind of new history of social Christianity in the United States. So definitely keeping busy here at the end of the academic year.
Nice.
That sounds awesome.
Sounds pretty cool. Yeah. That book sounds awesome anyway. Maybe we can hear a little bit more about that in a minute. Matt, what have you been up to?
Yeah, same. It is the end of the semester. I've got a lot to grade, a lot to teach. Tomorrow is Greenville's big interdisciplinary senior presentation day, and all my students are giving these really big presentations on incarceration and Christianity. So it'll be a pretty wild day. I'm really stressed out just thinking about it. Kind of got a tummy ache already, but tomorrow it'll all be over, so it'll be fine.
Nice.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty busy.
Yeah, for sure. What have you been doing, Dean?
Not too much. I did go to a very cool May Day event this weekend on Saturday at the United Steelworkers Hall. That was really fun. So the Communist Party of Canada was there, and a bunch of union people, and representatives from the Cuban embassy. That was pretty funny and cool. Yeah, I heard some Korean drumming from a Korean drum ensemble. It was a good time overall.
Yeah, that's neat. That's really cool. Yeah, looking forward to May Day. It's the sort of high holiday of like everyone on the left, so it'll be a cool time. It's like important to remember and conceptualize right. So to get kind of in the May Day spirit, Dean and I started looking into this book that Heath, you edited, called Pew and the Picket Line, which is a great title, by the way. It's a good one. So it's a cool book that you edited. There's a lot of good essays in there. There's one of my favorites that I started looking into last night was about Cairo, Illinois. That's not so far from where I live, so it holds a special place in my heart. Yeah. It's a really neat story. Well, anyways, so why is this the Pew and the Picket Line an important intersection to make note of? Why, like so the pew in the sense of the religious aspect of people's lives, but the picket line in the sense of the aspect of labor. Like why is that an important intersection? Why do you think that people should look at that, and why do you think that people ignore those things historically?
Yeah. I think the Pew and the Picket Line, I edited this book with two friends and colleagues, Chris Cantwell and Janine Giordano Drake, and we were interested in what we see as a pretty central intersection for shaping modern life, and an intersection of where people's lives at work and what their kind of fundamental beliefs and religious practices, what they have to do with economic life at work, everyday life in the world. So, I mean, the book is looking at the intersection from a whole host of different angles, from the experience of Black Power advocates in places like Cairo, Illinois, all the way back into the kind of classical period, the late 19th century, when you get the emergence of new working class theologies that are trying to make sense of industrial capitalism and its meaning for the modern world, offering a kind of working class critique of that along the lines of what I talk about in my own book, Union Made. So, I mean, I think this has been and continues to be a vitally important intersection historically. May Day, not often thought about as a kind of religious holiday, partly because it's associated with the more radical wing of the international labor movement. The reality, and I think this is something that many folks today don't realize, is that there are extensive connections between kind of the worlds of Christianity and the radical labor movement. The Haymarket martyrs, who I mentioned a moment ago, whose death in 1886 in Chicago, many of them were not traditional Christians, but they were deeply interested in the person of Jesus and saw Jesus as, in many cases, a kind of exemplar of, justice in the world. And we're constantly lifting him up. In fact, in the months before, after their trial and in the days leading up to their execution, August Spies, who was one of these Haymarket martyrs, was thinking about his experience as a radical worker and his efforts to kind of galvanize a radical workers movement, very much as a kind of modern parallel to the kinds of things that Jesus was up to in his lifetime. In fact, he explicitly makes explicit analogies between the Haymarket martyrs and the 12 disciples and Jesus and whatnot, and calls it talks about the Jerusalem Board of Trade and whatnot. So, lots and lots of connections. And I mean, part of the fun of this book, which is an edited volume with essays from all over kind of the country, is that it gives you just a sense of the variety of ways that religion and working class life have been coexisting and mutually reinforcing in different ways through the last 150 years.
That's cool. We were just talking about August Spies in the last episode, so he's fresh in our mind. Always fresh in our minds, August Spies.
There you go.
Fresh, never frozen, August Spies. It kind of, when you were talking, it made me think of a quote that we found from Eric Hobsbawm, the Marxist historian, who says May Day is, let me have it here. He says, May Day is perhaps the only unquestionable dent made by a secular movement in the Christian or any other official calendar. And on the one hand, I mean, there's something true about that, right? It's May Day is not a Christian holiday, right? And there, as you were just saying, there's all kinds of reasons why it's kind of important to note that difference. But at the same time, characterizing it as a secular movement is somewhat complicated too, because there's all kinds of really interesting religious strands, I guess, that feed into both the Haymarket kind of origins of May Day and then May Day more generally. So, yeah, maybe could you give us a little bit more like flavor about how like religion is feeding into May Day as it's been celebrated and in its kind of origins?
Well, I mean, I think obviously there's ebbs and flows in the kind of history of Christian involvement in the radical labor movement and the labor movement more broadly. But I think about, really the late 19th century and then the mid 20th century as two periods where you have really extensive overlap in those two spheres. So, I mean, I write in Union Made about kind of that late 19th century period where you have a lot of working people who are questioning the kind of consensus view that Christianity is on the side of capital, and workers really probing and pushing against that, pushing against the institutional churches, questioning their ties to emerging corporate structures in the Gilded Age United States. Those themes would never kind of go away. In fact, they became really important in the mid 20th century. And I think about people like Dorothy Day, who obviously out of a Catholic tradition is going to come to be a major supporter of labor, including in its most radical forms. Someone like Cesar Chavez, who is going to also draw, I mean, part of what's so interesting to me, and there is a tradition here, people like Day and Chavez in the mid 20th century, Catholic, proponents of working class activism are drawing explicitly on Gilded Age encyclicals that were in part a response to the working class activism of an earlier period. So I think about, you think about May Day, again, people don't often think about it in religious terms, but there's no question that some of the most important leaders and theorizers of working class activism in the modern United States and also around the world have been deeply influenced by their faith and religious views.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's what I love so much about your work, especially as a Christian person who cares about labor stuff, I guess. And maybe speaking about that, like for organizers and activists, like how do you think that these histories can or should be used? Like how could they inform the work that the labor movement is doing today?
Yeah, we had an event. Chris and Janine and I this past fall did an event with Interfaith Worker Justice in Chicago, where we had an opportunity to kind of see what in this book is interesting to contemporary activists. I think the thing that I find really to be important about the kinds of stories that we're telling in the Pew and the Picket Line, the kinds of work that is there's more and more of, I think, right now, as both religious historians and labor historians explore this intersection of religion and labor, is it punctures the kind of contemporary or recent. I don't know if it's a consensus anymore. I think things are shifting. Maybe very significantly shifting, but certainly by, in the kind of heyday of the new right in the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, I think there was a pretty widespread sense, and this is partly kind of a product of the kind of success of a neoliberal resurgence in the late 20th century, that economic life, that the market is somehow beyond or impervious to moral and ethical reflection, or that the market I mean, in some renditions of it, is the best agent of a moral economy itself, untempered, unchecked, that the market is going to produce that, or that, you know, the market's just going to do whatever it's going to do, and it's really not worthwhile to reflect ethically or morally on it. It's sort of like part of nature. And I think what you can see in the kind of work that's emerging now on these intersections of Christianity, the labor movement, socialism, and whatnot, is that those kinds of assumptions, which did partly, you know, really shape late 20th century American life, are contingent, historical assumptions and ideas that people haven't always thought that. In fact, American life hasn't always reflected those assumptions, and we can look to earlier moments in the history where there really are vibrant debates about the morality of the free market, about the necessity of working class activism as a check on greed and the wealthy. So I think that, you know, you see in these histories roads not traveled, roads that could still be traveled, other possibilities beyond what we see and have seen for some time as kind of normal and given.
Cool. Well, speaking of those histories, I guess I want to hear you speak a little bit on a kind of theoretical level about history, maybe, because what you do in the intro to the book, Pew and the Picket Line, is really interesting in terms of like what histories you're listening to and what histories we're counting. So in the introduction, you note that, like, I don't know, the history of religion and worker struggles revolved around sort of Protestant ecclesial hierarchies and institutions. But there's like a lot more to be said than just like what's going on there. And you have this kind of like great way of talking about the ways that some historians only kind of focus on the clergy or the pastors. But that your approach is to look more at the work, like the workers themselves and kind of the ordinary lives of people. Mm-hmm. So why do you think it's important to talk about mass movements behind some of the more obvious leaders, like of pastors and priests? Why is that something we should take our time to do?
Yeah, I mean, as a historian, I mean, Chris Jean and I, the editors, have all been pretty significantly influenced by social history and by labor history, both of which are historical traditions that see ordinary people's activism and ordinary people's lives as not just sort of decoration in terms of filling in the kinds of decor on the real story, which is about the great people who have shaped our societies, but that working people, ordinary people, have made a real impact. I think I think it's the epilogue of War and Peace. Tolstoy talks about in thinking about his own philosophy of history, it says, some people think that you can tell history through whatever Napoleon's orders were, whatever, Napoleon said is what happened. But, Tolstoy points out, like, actually, in fact, lots of things that Napoleon wanted to happen didn't happen. And so how do you explain that? And I think part of the way that social historians, labor historians would argue is that, things like something like the New Deal didn't descend from on high, but in fact, as Liz Cohen argues in her book, The Making of the New Deal, that this is made by workers. Workers create the space for that. And we see the same thing. And it's not just true of political life, it's true of religious life, that I think, the old ways of telling the history of Christianity through the stories of denominational leaders, through the stories of pastors, those are important and they're part of the story, but they're not the whole story. When I was writing Union Made, I mean, part of my question, and this partly came from my own experience as someone who grew up going to church and knew that, what do people do when they go to church, so you leave church and you talk about the sermon. It's not like, the pastor preaches a sermon. It's not like that's delivered and accepted as is, but there's a conversation about it. And those conversations happen at that smallest level around a dining room table or whatnot. They also happen at the big level, and ordinary folks, ordinary believers shape the history and reality of kind of Christian institutional life, of Christian doctrine and teaching. I mean, these are all things that are shaped through struggle, shaped through contest. And I think that's part of one of the assumptions of the Pew and the Picket line, and of a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, is that, Christianity, the meaning of Christianity for modern life is not given, it's not obvious, it's shaped through struggle. And working people, ordinary people have played central roles in that struggle and in trying to define the meaning of Christianity for the modern world.
Yeah, let's maybe talk a little bit more about some of those specific struggles, at least ones that maybe stick out to you or have stuck out to you and your colleagues. So, yeah, what are some of the more prominent struggles or groups or movements that kind of show this connection or this history from below about Christianity and labor?
The story is that this struggle is happening everywhere all the time, and so in terms of specifics, I think about like chapters in this book, the Pew and the Picket line, like the chapter on Emma Tenayuka, who's a kind of Catholic and Pentecostal sort of fudge, between these religious communities, woman and worker who galvanizes a pecan sheller strike in 1930s Texas. Tenayuka is messy. She doesn't fit like kind of the old institutional style histories of Christian social teaching or whatnot, because she's working between communities and working sometimes in cooperation with religious authorities, but oftentimes in spite of them. I think about someone like again, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, these people who galvanized the United Farm Workers movement in California in the 1960s and 70s. They're people who are not waiting for the bishops to weigh in on economic life, on the moral status of these growers and their policies toward workers. They're intervening into these struggles, and they're doing so. I mean, if you look at the story of the United Farm Workers, the UFW, I mean, these are folks who are carrying pictures of the Virgin de Guadalupe. Chavez is fasting and praying for the movement. He's citing Catholic social teaching, even as he's way out in front beyond what the church is willing to say in the scheme of that particular struggle. And I think you'll find that to be the case in so many different ways. I mean, it was the case in my work in Union Made, where I'm arguing that working people are the ones who really innovated and really forged the first social gospels. Working people didn't need bishops, priests, pastors, seminary teachers to tell them what the Bible had to say about capitalism and the way the industrial order of the late 19th century. They had an intuitive sense of this. They were responding out of their faith and saw their faith and their quest for economic justice as being fully compatible, despite the fact that many of the leaders of their churches didn't see it that way. So I think you'll find it all over the place. I mean, in this book, Allison Green's essay on kind of cooperatives and radical economics in the South, interracial cooperation. Jared Roll's fantastic book, Spirit of Rebellion, is all about the ways that Pentecostal revivalism in late 1930s Missouri brought together white and black sharecropping farmers who found in the kind of language and rhetoric and ideas of a Pentecostal revival the power to come together across racial lines to fight for their rights as sharecroppers. So I mean, I could go on for the rest of the hour just talking about different case studies of how working class activism messes the categories and shows you how working people have kind of really made an impact on the history of American Christianity.
Yeah, well, speaking of messing those categories, so I am not a great historian of sort of the labor movement in the United States, but the one example that always sticks out to me when I read your work is the IWW, in the way that they in the past would use like appropriated hymns to kind of spread their own gospel. So it's a collapsing of the IWW sort of party line and also religious music. There's a great quote from Utah Phillips, sort of the storyteller of the IWW, who says that the Wobblies would use hymns because they were really pretty, but change the words so they were more true. To me, I guess that's another example of the religiosity of everyday life of people. Can you tell us a little bit more about that connection between the appropriation of religious music and labor?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the IWW's use of hymns and whatnot is often treated by labor historians as an example of kind of secularization. I mean, it's sort of a story that you can use to say, like, look at this is why we don't talk about May Day as a religious holiday, because look, these people are taking the religious content out and inserting this kind of secular, radical, working class rhetoric. I think the story is a lot more complicated than that, and I think the in many ways, something like the IWW, you can, if you sort of dive into it, you'll find that it's not a sort of one way. I think it's wrong to think about either this is like a story about secularization or a story about how like Christianity is what sparked the IWW. It's more of a story of the fact that for many people, including many radical workers in the United States in the history of the modern United States, some of life's deepest, most important questions have been most persuasively answered for them in Christianity, even as they've found the churches and institutionalized forms of Christianity to be deeply unsatisfactory. And so I think a lot of times in the IWW, you'll find folks who are, and in the radical working class more broadly, you find a lot of dissatisfaction with the churches. A lot of dissatisfaction with the ways that Christianity is kind of embodied in American life and in the institutions and religious leadership. But you also find a kind of continual return in many cases to Christian ideas, to the person of Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think about Dave Burns' work on the life and death of the radical historical Jesus. And he's really arguing in that book that starting in the late 19th century, radical workers, the Haymarket martyrs included, but people like Eugene Debs, folks in the IWW, see in Jesus, a model and an exemplar. And so I think this stuff is messy, and I think for a lot of folks, the IWW's religiosity doesn't seem very religious because it's not contained within the structures of the kind of recognized churches and denominational bodies. But in many cases, I think that folks in the IWW would say what the workers that I write about in Union Made say, which is, given where the churches fall in the class struggle, I'm out, and Jesus Christ is with me on the outside of the churches. And so that's the kind of messiness that I think you'll find if you sort of dig into this intersection of the pew and the picket line.
Yeah, that's one thing I think I really admire about the book too, is finding Jesus outside of the church, I guess, is kind of a really interesting and an important narrative. I don't know, it's cool how those stories kind of get told. I mean, when we talked to you about Union Made, that was a kind of common thing, right? That sometimes the churches betray the message of Christ for people who are actually suffering. So dig that a lot. Could you talk a little bit too about how Christianity and the labor movement related to other struggles for justice in the U.S., like gender equality or Black liberation? I mean, that's something that's reflected in the edited volume, it seems like, and a concern that's kind of on the table for history telling and that sort of thing. So yeah, how do all those things go together?
Yeah. Well, I think it would be nice, obviously, if there was some cohesive story to be told about how, starting with the rise of industrial capitalism in the late 19th century, that there was some kind of coherent, radical Christian movement that was seeking to do all of those things. And I don't know that, unfortunately, you find that in the history. But what you do find are movements for racial justice, Black liberation, movements for gender equality, movements for economic justice that oftentimes are developing apart from one another or with some tenuous connection at times. I think about someone like Ida B. Wells, who is in many ways a pretty traditional Christian, who's the most courageous, anti-lynching advocate of the late 19th and early 20th century. Her struggle and that of like workers in the IWW are oftentimes not going to be like one struggle in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what you find, and I think, as you move further into the 20th century, in the 1930s, you do get a kind of merging of some of these movements. Like the CIO becomes a vehicle for a kind of cross-racial
labor coalition, in somewhat, in contrast to the American Federation of Labor, which had long been permitted and sometimes been explicitly racist in its local unions. The CIO is going to bring together radicals, communists, socialists, black and white, in the attempt to forge one big union. And that's always a tough thing to maintain, and it would be tough for the CIO. I mean, the context of the United States, white supremacy is pervasive, and the ability to sustain cross-racial coalitions not easy. But again, in the civil rights movement and especially on the left side of the civil rights movement, a lot of people would argue that the kind of classical civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s has an earlier instantiation in kind of the radical labor movement of the 1930s, which included people like A. Philip Randolph, who has a somewhat tenuous connection, I think, to Christianity. But his work within the CIO, which has extensive Catholic connections, and that work being brought forward by people like King, who, while he's often more associated with his "I Have a Dream" speech and the color of their skin, not the color of their skin, but the content of their character, King also has in many ways a sort of democratic socialist outlook that is less in tension with Randolph than it's sometimes portrayed. So I think that part of this new book that I'm working on, it's called On Earth as It Is in Heaven, Social Christians and the Fight to End American Inequality. I mean, that is a book that's looking at the variety of struggles, but it hasn't been one long, big struggle of all the radical Christians fighting on the same team for the last 150 years. It's been a lot more challenging than that to sustain these coalitions across kind of lines of race, class, and gender. Though, I think if you read in kind of radical stuff today, you find people still think that, like Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's work, I think about her book From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, still hoping that could come to fruition, something like a cross-racial class coalition of workers in this country. So who knows? The hope never dies, but it hasn't been easy to hold people together across those lines, historically speaking.
Yeah, for sure. There's lots of complications. I guess, though, what seems really instructive about your work, just reading Pew and the Picket Line and then Union Made, too, is that it seems like, like the religious life and the collective power of labor unions actually has an effect on culture, which is I guess the good news, right? And I guess it's instructive because it tells me that we probably shouldn't wait around for our clergy members to have all the bright ideas, because they probably won't. Yeah. There's a quote from your book where you say, "The American workplace itself has been a site of religious construction. We find in these essays that the monotony of Detroit's assembly line prompted auto workers to jettison long-standing religious valorizations of work, while the dangers of Joplin's mines yielded new fascinations with faith healing." So the idea here that I just mentioned, that the daily life of workers also can change theology, is really interesting. So could you tell us a little bit more about that connection? Do you have any other kind of good examples of how labor changes the way we think about religious ideas of labor? And do you have any ideas about how the radically changing shape of our labor today with digital media and automation might be changing how Christians think about labor? That's a lot of questions all in one, but
that is a lot of questions all in one. I think, I think the basic insight here is, where do people's religious ideas come from? How are their religious practices shaped? And I think our basic assumption in the Pew and the Picket Line, and what we found borne out in the history, is that people's everyday lives, there's a kind of mutually reinforcing thing here where, religious traditions there's a corpus of ideas and practices that are passed down, but they're also inflected through the realities of people's lives. I mean, if you're a coal miner, you're facing, dangerous circumstances every day of your life. It shapes the way that you think about your faith, and it shapes the kind of, I think there's been a lot of work in recent years showing how people's work really does impact the kind of daily practice of their faith. I think it's a great question to think about, like how does the changing shape of the modern workplace, what does it, portend for American Christianity, American religious life? Gosh, I want to know the answer to that question too. I don't know that I know, but I think I don't doubt that there will be that, in 25 years, 30 years, people look back and really see this kind of shift to, post-union in many ways, it seems right now, at least, and increasingly digital work from home. I mean, all this kind of stuff. I do think that this portends big things. I think partly it seems to me like it, the ways in which, sure, digital stuff brings people together, but it also isolates people. Work from, the work from home kind of thing. How do you organize? How do you fight for collective bargaining and whatnot in workplaces that are, no longer like 100 people on an assembly line. It's people stream. Those are really complicated kinds of questions, and I think the modern labor movement is trying to figure out those things, and I think that churches and religious bodies are trying to figure out those things. I will say, one of the things, and kind of harkening back to your question earlier about how do these stories relate to modern struggles, I was really struck when we did that event with Interfaith Worker Justice last fall. A number of people mentioned that, in their churches were often progressive on, at least on the face of it, on racial issues, but that if you brought up labor unions, if you brought up these kinds of things, that it was sort of a non-starter. And I thought that was really fascinating in terms of, the ways in which, and I think about that in a lot of religious contexts with religious institutions struggling in this moment. I think about, there's been interesting work done in recent years on kind of religious institutions as themselves workplaces that oftentimes are pretty difficult workplaces for workers. And what does it mean? I think about Janice Thiessen's work on Mennonites in Canada, and she's done all this fascinating research showing how, Mennonites who are, in many ways, very concerned about justice are also at the same time, like, really hostile to unions. And so I think that this stuff on, these stories in the Pew and the Picket line, the stories of kind of the history of the radical labor movement past, do pose really interesting questions for progressive religious communities today, which, are progressive on some issues and maybe not enough on some of these key class questions and key questions about labor. So I think that shows in the fact that, America is a lot more religious in terms of, religious affiliation, even as those numbers are dwindling, but they're still a lot higher than the percentage of union workers in this country.
That's a pretty interesting comment to think about. A little while back, we were talking with Kaya Oakes, who's a Catholic journalist, and she does all kinds of really interesting writing. And she has written on the nuns, the NONES phenomenon. So, young Christians are sort of less and less likely to identify with specific religious denominations, but that doesn't mean that they're not spiritual per se. It's just a different kind of maybe kind of like floating spirituality or something. And it does sort of seem like there's a similar issue happening with a lot of labor problems now. I was just talking with a friend at this May Day event who's part of organizing a union for the video games industry. And he was like, it's like a really weird thing because software developers and programmers, like, it's a lot of contract labor and people are kind of like moving from job to job or like getting let go after doing a big project. And it's actually like really hard to make all those things coalesce. But that's the nature of labor today for a lot of people, even for people with like more boring or like traditional jobs, right? So yeah, I don't know. Do you see any kind of connections between those two sociological phenomena? Like, people are kind of floating around religion, but they're not necessarily not religious. And in the same way, people are kind of floating around like issues of economic justice, but they're not, they're skeptical maybe of like joining unions or that kind of a thing.
I've often wondered, if the nuns phenomenon, especially among younger people in this country, if it isn't directly linked in some ways to the church's inaction or kind of relative stodginess around a lot of these kinds of issues. I think especially been really interested. There's been a number of pieces showing how millennials and even the generation coming up behind them are, in many cases, hearkening back to really, really concerned about some of the kind of economic justice questions that really drove the left of the 1930s. And it's not clear to me that, again, that the churches in this country are particularly concerned with those issues. So I've wondered if there is kind of a connection there, and if churches were really out in front in these struggles for justice, would there be more interest in affiliation among younger people? I mean, I don't know. I think people are still trying to figure out the nuns in general, but I think part of the story is that these questions about the kind of structure of the economy and what people call this new Gilded Age, that they aren't things that have a kind of visceral component to them, or it's at least more difficult to kind of paint them in these visceral ways that I do think, help to stoke interest in social movements. I think part of what we're seeing is a kind of a long-term shift in the kind of in sort of rising inequality. I mean, how do you capture rising inequality? How do you galvanize widespread interest around it? How do you get people organized around it? I think, if you think about like an organization like Black Lives Matter, which has been really, I think, effective at galvanizing concern around police violence and against brutality toward people of color, which can be captured on video, and that's part of what's driven the movement. I think Black Lives Matter and other kind of social justice organizations of the present moment struggle a little bit more to get people really organized around these kind of longer term questions about the structure of the class structure of the United States and the kind of worrisome historic levels of inequality that we're experiencing right now. It's just harder to explain that. It's harder to give an account of where that's coming from, and harder to kind of get people rallied around it. I think that we have seen more of that in the last few years. That's why I think we're at an interesting moment. Obviously, the 2016 election, a lot of talk around inequality, whether or not that can be channeled into kind of a revival of some of the kinds of movements we're talking about in the Pew and the Picket line. I don't know. I mean, I think it'll be really interesting to see. Obviously, around the economic recession in 2008, you got Occupy Wall Street, a lot of kind of talk and interest in these issues, but not an ability to kind of translate that into, at least yet, a kind of movement that could exact change at the policy level. And I think that's the thing that will, as a historian, I don't know what to expect. It's happened in the past. I know that, the coalition that won the New Deal legislation in the 1930s did it through hard struggle, and whether it can happen again, I don't know.
Well, to round the conversation out, do you want to tell us about your new book? Preemptively promote it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I still got a lot of work to do on it, but it's like I said, it's called On Earth as It Is in Heaven: Social Christians and the Fight to End American Inequality, and it basically looks at again these kind of different, diverse Christian movements that have seen the fight against inequality as a central part of what it means to be Christian in the modern world. So I think about it as kind of a new history of the social gospel in American life. Oftentimes the social gospel is thought of as kind of this crusty theological movement in elite white Protestant circles. Obviously, Union Made was challenging that view, offering kind of a working class origin story to the movement. I'm thinking about social Christianity and about this story that I'm writing up now as a kind of long tradition in American life that really gets going in a fulsome way after the Civil War, and that peaks not in the early 20th century as the old story would have it, but rather in the mid 20th century with these massive faith-infused labor and civil rights movements that fundamentally changed the nation. And I think, like I said, you could look to people like Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, and find, if you look back, kind of origin stories in the late 19th and early 20th century when you get grassroots movements calling for Christian people to address the fight for a more equal society as sort of a central piece of what it means to be Christian. So that's the basic overview. So it's a story that'll trace kind of in three parts the emergence at the grassroots of this kind of new consciousness in the wake of the Civil War in the early 20th century, looking at how social gospels gained institutional ground both within the churches and within the state, culminating in the New Deal. But there's a big backlash against the New Deal, and so the energy moves back to the grassroots, and that's where you have people like Day and Chavez, King, etc., who would be able to sort of draw on these earlier traditions and mobilize lots and lots of Americans to not just change the churches, but change the society in which we live. So thinking a lot about this intersection of Christianity and inequality right now, which the story of May Day is certainly an important part of.
Cool. Well, we can maybe ask you we have this stock question that sometimes we remember to ask people and sometimes we don't. But I just remembered. We almost forgot. But what's something that you wish that leftists maybe knew about Christianity, and what's something that you wish that Christianity knew about, or Christians knew about the history of the left or labor in general?
That's a great question. Well, I think the thing that I wish that left folks knew about Christianity is that, like I said, I think given that we're living in the wake of a generation in which Christianity in the United States has been, in its institutional forms especially, but also to some extent at the grassroots, pretty strongly aligned with the right. I would like for people on the left to understand that there's nothing necessary about that alignment, and that in the past, as recently as the mid 20th century, that Christianity was a fast friend of the left and of the causes that are kind of close to the heart of the left today. So I think that's one thing that I wish the left knew about Christianity, and I think conversely, I wish that more American Christians, who I think partly shaped by the history I was just referencing, kind of have this intuitive sense that to be on the left is to reject Christianity or something like that. And I just think again that's historically that's just not the case. And so I wish that I wish that there could be some kind of better understanding of the ways in which the histories of Christianity and the left are actually much more intertwined. Whereas, it can seem from our vantage here in the early 21st century, like, these are two separate roads. And historically, that hasn't been the case. And looking ahead, it doesn't have to be the case, even though there's a lot of work to get done if more people on both sides are going to recognize those possibilities.
Well, I think that sounds pretty cool. I think that's a good answer to that question.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Heath, for coming on the show anyhow, and we'll be sure to look forward to your new book coming out. Do you have any idea when it will be out, or that's it's still too early to say?
It's still too early to say, but hopefully around the time of the next presidential election, right around then.
Nice.
We'll see how long exactly it takes me to write this thing up, but hopefully by around that time.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, guys. Always good to talk to you.
When Jesus come to town, the working folks around believed what he did say. The bankers and the preachers, they nailed him on a cross, and they laid Jesus Christ in his grave. Now the working people followed him around, sang and shouted gay. But the cops and soldiers nailed him in the air, and they laid Jesus Christ in his grave.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you tuned in to hear the Magnificats, we're sorry, but also thanks for sticking around. Thanks, Heath, also for coming back on the show. Really great to have Heath. I always love history podcasts. I learn so much, and then I feel way smarter, and then I talk to other people, and they're like, Christians can't be good lefties, and I say, well, I don't know. I listened to a historian, and he told me they can, so it must be true. If you liked what you heard here, and how could you not, you can go ahead and find us all over the internet. We're on Twitter at The Magnificast. We're on Facebook at The Magnificast. We're also on 2 podcast networks, Theology Corner and Critical Mediations, also full of really good stuff, so you can find some more great things to listen to and read and check out. And lastly, if you want to support us, you can do that on patreon.com/The Magnificast. Thanks so much. See you next week.
Well, the people held their breath when they heard about his death. Everybody wondered why. It was the landlord and the soldiers that he hired to nail Jesus Christ in the sky. This song was made in New York City of rich mans and preachers and slaves. If Jesus was to preach like he preached in Galilee, they would lay Jesus Christ in his grave.